Good morning. I'm Judith Janowitz. I'm an associate professor and a member of the Magee-Womens Research Institute, and it's my great pleasure this morning to welcome David Haig. He was born in Canberra and grew up in Sydney and received degrees from Macquarie University. He was a Royal Society Endeavour Fellow at Oxford and then a Junior Fellow in the Harvard Society of Fellows. He's now the George Putnam Professor of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology and Chair of the Australian Studies Committee at Harvard University. His main research interests are maternal-fetal relations, intragenomic conflict, and the evolution of plant life cycles, but he still misses the kookaburras. Please join us in welcoming David Haig.
Thank you. Welcome. Thank you so much for the invitation. I feel a little bit like the old Monty Python line of, and now for something completely different. As an evolutionary biologist, I'm principally interested in why things have evolved the way they are, why we see the particular mechanisms that we do, rather than what are those mechanisms. And I'd start with, in Mary's talk about maternal mortality, here is one example of this. In 19th century Sweden, 1 in 14 married women died at childbirth. Women throughout human history have known that pregnancy is a time of particular health risks. And this has created, in a beneficent world in which our bodies have evolved to perform optimally, this sort of a problem. What is going on here? One of the classic answers to this is from Genesis, and God speaks to Eve, "I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children." And in the Genesis story, the complications of pregnancy were portrayed as punishment for tasting of the tree of knowledge. The popular idea among biological anthropologists that women suffer because of our large brains not fitting through the pelvis. Oh, good. Oh, that feels much better. Is a retelling of this myth. Problems of fitting through the pelvis are actually not, among the major difficulties that women face during pregnancy. The problems did not affect just the poor. They were probably concentrated in the poor, but I'm going to look at some historical cases of very well-off women who in these two cases died during pregnancy. This is Princess Charlotte, who died at 21 years of age. She was the heir of King George IV, and she died giving birth to a stillborn son. The British royal family was without an heir, and so the Duke of Clarence, who was not of the marrying kind, was told that he had to produce an heir rather quickly. And 18 months later, Alexandrina Victoria, who became Queen Victoria, was born. So we wouldn't have had the Victorian age without the death of Princess Charlotte. Her husband was Leopold of Belgium, who became Leopold I of Belgium. He remarried and he had 6 children, one of whom was Charlotte, Empress of Mexico, married to Maximilian of Austria. And so this shows quite clearly that cost to pregnancy can have very different effects on the fitness through the maternal line. Charlotte died, and in the paternal line, Leopold went on and had many other children. This is an example in evolutionary biology. This is the eldest grandchild of Charles and Emma Darwin. This is Bernard Darwin, born in 1876. He grew up to be an expert on golf, and so this is Bernard Darwin on Golf, the book. He was the first grandchild of Charles and Emma Darwin. His mother, Amy Ruck, died of fever 4 days after his birth, and so Bernard was raised at Down House by Charles and Emma. His father, Francis Darwin, remarried, and he had other children. Well, he had a daughter with his second marriage, once again showing this separation of effects on the maternal and the paternal side. So mortality during pregnancy is one thing that begs an answer. Most human embryos fail to establish a viable pregnancy under some estimates, and perhaps 10% of couples experience difficulties producing a child. Now, as an evolutionary biologist, if pregnancy is central to reproductive fitness, shouldn't it proceed more smoothly rather than less smoothly than other physiological processes? And clearly it doesn't. And why is this case? We normally think of natural selection as coming up with very, very efficient outcomes that work well most of the time, and disease is a rare event, something failing to function. But pregnancy seems to be different, and the reason for that difference is sitting here. This is a photo of a Nepali woman. In fact, it's a photo of 3 different genetic individuals who are involved in a complex interaction. So she's got the young girl that she's holding in her arms. She's also carrying she's carrying a fetus at the time. And those 2 offspring, in a sense, are competing with each other for maternal physiological effort. And she's also working hard. She's carrying a basket on her back, collecting food or whatever. And so this is a very complicated situation where they're potentially different genetic individuals, sometimes acting at cross purposes. So fetuses, one thing to say, is in the same genetic relation to mothers as is the child after birth. And when we're raising children, we know that sometimes things go smoothly, sometimes it's like this, but sometimes it's different from that. Sometimes there's a very high noise to signal ratio seeming in the signals you're getting from the child. And I think pregnancy is essentially the same sort of relationship as that with a child. It can go smoothly for whiles, and then there can be a breakdown of communication, and there can be demands coming on the mother where it's not very clear what is needed or how to respond. So raising a child prenatally and postnatally, I would argue, is a little more like politics of conflicting interests than it is like engineering, where everything is incredibly precise. And we know that politics is not like engineering. Just look at what's been happening in this country over the last 8 years or so. Politics does not always produce efficient outcomes. There are results like Arrow's impossibility theorem that says, there is no way that you don't occasionally get pathologies of decision making when you have conflicting interests engaged. So I've talked about one of the conflicts in the system, and that's actually within the genome of the child. It's how I got into the subject for genomic imprinting, that maternal and paternal genes of the fetus have distinct genetic interests and experience different costs of fetal demands on the mother. And I gave the example of Amy Ruck and also of Princess Charlotte. In that case, the mother died, and yet paternal genes that were in that child have a chance of being transmitted through the offspring of other women. Something in which there's less evidence, but I think is important, is that half of the genes of a mother are absent from each particular embryo. And if you think about it, those genes, the non-inherited genes in the mother, gain no benefit from investment in that particular child, and would in fact benefit from that child's demise if another child was compensated for it that had a chance of carrying the same genes. And that's not the way that we think about the evolution of maternal care of offspring. The principal reason this isn't a problem, I think, is that most maternal genes evolutionarily possess no information about whether a particular embryo possesses their copies, and therefore they have not evolved to discriminate. It's a 50-50 chance they're transmitted to the offspring, and so they evolve to maximize number of surviving offspring. There is an exception to this, and that is sitting within the immune system. The immune system has evolved to distinguish self from non-self, and so for non-inherited maternal MHC haplotypes, for example, sitting in the mother, a fetus that has not inherited their copies is non-self, and evolution will tend to favor treating them as such. And so I think this may have something quite a lot to do with those very, very high rates of early pregnancy loss that we were looking at. So the implicit model of pregnancy has been of a well-functioning machine with disease the result of some malfunctioning part. And so what most of women's health, obstetrics in particular, is looking for the part that is broken. And I think that this model may be incorrect for some of the problems of pregnancy. Some of the complications of pregnancy resemble political malfunction more than mechanical malfunction. And in particular, some diseases of pregnancy, what the fetus is doing, and I'm including the placenta with the fetus, is a well-evolved adaptation which has many parts, but it's causing pathology in the mother or vice versa. Of course, those complex adaptations also, parts always break down, so the older pathological model has some importance sitting here, but I think we need to understand what the system has evolved to do better. And the implicit assumption that all is harmony in a pregnancy, I think, can be misleading. So maternal pathology can sometimes be fetal physiology. Now, don't get me wrong, obstetrics has made great advances in the 20th century and now into the 21st century for a number of reasons. Antibiotics were a major improvement, uterotonics, etc. But some problems have remained intractable in that time, and I suggest that we're not thinking about them in quite the right way. For many years I've been obsessed with preeclampsia, and preeclampsia has been called the disease of theories. Here's Walker in 2017 calling it the disease of theory. I have insatiable curiosity, and when did preeclampsia first be called the disease of theories? This is the earliest case. This is Zweifel in 1895, so this is well over 100 years. The important words here is the Krankheit der Theorien, the disease of theories. So back in 1895, eclampsia in this case, preeclampsia hadn't been named, was called the disease of theories. Also in the quote, he calls it the Tummelplatz der Theorien, which is the romping ground or playground of theories. Perhaps we should start to use that instead. And problems that remain unsolved for more than a century suggest that in some sense we are thinking about them in the wrong way. So back in 1993, I started being interested in pregnancy, moving from my work in botany, in plant development, and I found pregnancy as an evolutionary biologist one of the most fascinating of relationships. I wrote this paper, Genetic Conflicts in Human Pregnancy, and with those delusions of grandeur that you have as a young man, I thought this paper would revolutionize obstetrics and evolutionary biology. People would totally change the way they looked at all sorts of things, and it did not. It's had minor influence, but not a major influence. And so I've entered what's been called the philosophores. That's when older scientists no longer have good new ideas in science and they go off waffling on philosophical topics. And I'm devoting my time to understanding the cause of my failure to convince people that they really needed to change the way that they're looking at things. And this partly led to a recent book that came out with perfect timing the month after the beginning of the COVID shutdown. And this is looking at teleology and thinking about purposiveness in biology. Now, in any biological system, there are two important questions that you can ask about the system. One is the question of mechanism. How is it done? What is the mechanism? And this has dominated biology for the last 200 years. When it comes to clinical interventions, this is the key question. But there is a different question. Why do we see these mechanisms when there could be many other different mechanisms? This is the question, what is a thing good for, or what is its purpose? And as a biology student, I was taught that the second question was teleological and unscientific. And I am still told this by anonymous reviewers. You know, every second review I get will tell me off for my being unscientific and my use of teleological language. And yet I think the question of the purpose is central to it's what's distinctive about biology. It's central to understanding a system. Cardiologists understand that the purpose of a heart is pumping blood and delivering oxygen. If they didn't have that basic model, you know, where would cardiology be? This is crucial to understanding, but the language of purpose, not so much in cardiology, but in many other parts of biology, is often avoided. And I believe an understanding of some of the major complications of pregnancy will require a more sophisticated working model of the conflicting purposes among different sets of genes that are operating in the maternal fetal unit during pregnancy. And this is getting into the philosophers in a big way, in a sense. The final metaphor of my book is that natural selection is a poet, not an engineer. So you have variants arise and they're being selected by the environment on their effects in a complex whole. When you're writing a poem, you're choosing this word versus that, but on the basis of the word's interaction with that complicated system. So the best word is chosen from the available alternatives because of its contribution to the highly interactive whole. And so I would suggest that understanding biological systems, sometimes they're a little less like machines and more like a poem. And that has some problems for scientifically thinking about what's going on. The structures of living things usually mean many different things at once. And how do we deal with that? A less poetic analogy, if you don't like poetry, and we've talked quite a lot about artificial intelligence already in this talk, is that current AI programs evolved by a form of natural selection. There is feedback from output to changing the inputs. The reason it becomes teleological now is that the outputs can have a causal role in determining the inputs. And current artificial intelligence programs achieve remarkable processes, remarkable feats by processes that are obscure. We know everything there is to know about an artificial intelligence. You can get a printout. This is the vision of all the omics revolution. If we knew everything to precision, surely we would understand the system. And I think artificial intelligence is a cautionary tale to that. here are systems that we understand perfectly at a mechanistic level, and we don't understand how they achieve what they do, and that's essentially by complex nonlinear interactions within the network. And so I suspect that's going to be a problem in biology. We will get our spaghetti diagrams of this is connected to this and that, and it won't really tell us much about what the system is doing. To understand an artificial intelligence, we need to understand the problem it has been trained or has evolved to solve. And I think the challenge for future biology will be to combine the mechanical perspectives and also a more poetic approach to understanding living things. And with that, I'll finish and answer any questions that you might have.
Alyssa.
Yes.
Hi. So we can understand when we're thinking about biology, about mechanism, but with poetry, you don't often understand the meaning and requires a lot of contemplation. So how do we get to that poetic part? How do we understand that?
I think that is a really difficult problem, and that's why I ended it with that. But in poetry appreciation, not everything goes, and some interpretations reveal more than others do, and some are recognized as being more useful. And so when I'm thinking of the poetry of a living system, I'm just thinking of, if you ask what this gene does, it is doing many, many different things at once. Just as people in a society, they're not just, Yol is not just, the director of Magee, but he probably plays an instrument and does, many different things. And that's not a way an engineer designs a system, but it's the way biological systems have evolved. And so I'm not saying we get a way of mechanism, but we need to think. I do think that thinking what is the problem that this is solving is a very, very important part of addressing any biological system. Thanks.
You well?
It was terrific, David. Will the field of synthetic biology, pushed by many of your colleagues at Harvard, will that allow us to sift between mechanics and poetry?
So George, it would be good to have George Church here because, he would probably disagree very, very strongly. He is very much, if you can build it, you understand it. I don't think that even George could build an organism without actually sort of plagiarizing existing organisms because we don't understand those interactions well enough. And so in practice in his synthetic biology, he's using a lot of prior evolution that is already doing many things. Synthetic biology will be important, but the example I've given of an artificial intelligence where you can know everything mechanistic about a system, it doesn't give you necessarily give much insight. In artificial intelligence, the move is for what they call explainable AI, artificial intelligence, the program telling you why it's making the decision it's doing, and that's getting towards self-awareness. And we have theories about why we do what we do, but we don't have deep insight into the actual mechanism of what's taking place in our body. We give sort of higher level explanations. Thanks.
So David, I want to push you on the point about what is it good for?
Yeah.
Not because I don't believe it, but preeclampsia, so I think you want to challenge us. What is preeclampsia potentially good for? How did it evolve? So I'm curious your thought about that. But also, evolution doesn't favor the best of a system. It favors whatever's good at that moment, right? And so how do you explain something like preeclampsia, which could have just been an environmental accident.
Yeah. So preeclampsia is the disease of theories. So here is my theory. If you know Monty Python again, there is My Theory of the Brontosaurus by Anne Elk. I think that the factors that are being released during preeclampsia are a fetal adaptation to increase blood supply to the placenta that are switched on in cases of fetal malnutrition. So in a sense, that's the opposite of assumption in a lot of the literature, is that it's cutting off blood supply. But in fact, as long as you increase peripheral resistance more than the uteroplacental supply, the proportion of maternal blood going to the placenta is increasing. So that's the theory. And what I would say in taking that perspective is important, that most preeclampsia research is looking for the part that is broken, what is malfunctioning, whereas I suggest what the fetus is doing is an evolved adaptation that has multiple parts. Everybody's favorite molecule, whether it's soluble FLT1 or leptin or you name it, is probably part of a coordinated action on the fetal part. Most of the time that doesn't result in severe preeclampsia. The fetus is benefiting from it. And so a question still remaining in preeclampsia is the fetus better off with or without the disease? Perhaps before severe disease, I think the fetus is benefiting, but we all know the clinical dilemmas of preeclampsia. What is good for the fetus and what is best for the mother are different. The longer you delay, the better for the fetus, but the greater the risk to the mother, and that's really bringing these conflicts home.
Thank you. One more question.
I have a question thinking about mechanism versus purpose.
Yeah.
I would sort of think that they are integrally related,
Yeah.
so that if, for example, someone is studying a mechanism, why is this gene expressed? What is
Yeah.
the mechanism by which this gene is expressed in this particular cell? Isn't the goal of understanding that mechanism to understand the purpose of that gene being expressed into that cell?
Yeah, and I think in practice we do it all the time, but sort of what I'm saying is that people's implicit model, and the implicit model here in pregnancy is that it's a purely cooperative system where the purpose is to maximize mother's health and baby's health. Every women's center has a beautiful picture of loving mother with baby, but it's that crying baby is another part of the phenomenon. And I would, yes, like people to appreciate and to expand their idea of what the purposes are in these systems. Thank you.
And one last question.
We've been talking about what the purpose of preeclampsia in an individual is.
Yeah.
And I keep going back and forth between thinking about the individual versus the greater population. I'd be curious what you think about whether diseases in an individual might present some advantage on a population basis.
So as a evolutionary biologist, as an adaptationist, the idea that things evolve for the good of the species or the population, that came under severe criticism in the 1970s, and those arguments, natural selection is this alternative versus some other one in the within the population, and so something may be favoured even though it's not good for the species as a whole. An example I sometimes use in my courses, is all those male weapons for bashing heads together and whatever. Surely they'd be better off without it. But if some males are unarmed, the males who have armaments have an advantage. And so there was a movement, and you see it in, for example, Dawkins' selfish gene, first of all, to say that things aren't for the good of the species, they're for the good of the individual. And where I come in, I'm saying, that is wrong. And the example of genomic imprinting, where you have genes of maternal and paternal origin within the same individual doing contradictory things. So in placental development, it's largely the genes that are coming from the father that are driving placental growth. Hydatidiform mole is an extreme example of that, where all of the genes are paternal. And so even the individual themselves is not harmonious, and there can be conflicts within the individual. Thank you.
Thank you.
Join me in thanking Dr. Haig for a thought-provoking seminar.